In this series, I'm documenting my journey creating a real-world app, Fudge-it 2, from scratch using Quasar 2, Vue 3 and the Composition API, an app that will ultimately be deployed to the iOS, Android, Mac and Windows app stores. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about this swipe to reveal options functionality, this drag to reorder items functionality, how I created this swipe to go back functionality, and this parallax effect that you can see between page transitions. I'll also be showing you how this app is performing on a real device so far, and I'll be sharing what I think of the Composition API now, having now used it on a real world project for several weeks. Make sure you subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss any of the videos in this series, and check out the link to the whole playlist in the description. So this week I've been carrying on with the front end of this budget section. I still have a long way to go with this section. So I've added this new edit budget dialog, which we can see if we click this button here. And this is a lot like the add budget dialog, but it also has these buttons that the user can click as well. And I wanted to give the user a shortcut to access some of these options. So I've also added this swipe to reveal options functionality, so the user can have a quick way of getting to these options. And I've done this using Quasar's built-in touch events. And I also wanted to give the user a way to reorder items. So I've also added the ability to reorder items by drag and drop. And I've done this using the vue draggable package. And when the user is on any kind of child page, they can always go back by hitting the back button up here. But I've also added the ability to swipe right to go back as well. So if I swipe right, we can also go back like that. And you can see I have a nice little parallax effect as well between these page transitions. So I've added that as well. And back in video 3, I talked about these Pane components. And I mentioned that I have these spaces for the header and the footer within this Q scroll area, because by default, this scroll area goes right up to the top of the view and right down to the bottom here. So I needed a spacer up here and down here to stop the content of the current pane going up behind the header or down below the footer. So we can see a pane header spacer here. And if I delete that, you can see the content goes up behind the header. And I mentioned that I would need to make the height of these spacers dynamic, because sometimes the height of the header and the pane footer can change. And I have managed to get this working this week, so that whenever the height of the header or the pane footer changes, the height of these spaces will change as well. So if we inspect the actual header, this is currently 51 pixels tall, and the pane header spacer is also 51 pixels tall. And if I just jump to the header and change the height to, let's say, 100 pixels, then we can see instantly that the pane header spacer div has also been set to a height of 100 pixels. And so when the header height changes, we don't see our content disappear behind the new header. And I've also been testing the app on a real device, and I'll show you how it's looking later on. Let's see how this swipe to reveal options functionality is working. So I'll jump to this component, this budget list item component, which is in source, components, budgets and budget list item.vue. So this QCard component is this item here. And in the last video, I was actually using a vue.js Pane event on this component, which allowed us to actually click and drag this over. But that wasn't playing very nicely with the vue draggable library, which is used to reorder these items. So you would click to drag on this item and it would just start firing the vue draggable functionality. So I've actually replaced that vue.js Pane event with these vue.js swipe events instead. So although we can no longer click and drag these items to the left, we can achieve the same effect by just doing a quick swipe to the left to reveal the items and a quick swipe to the right to hide them. So I have one vue.js swipe event for a left swipe by using this left modifier, which will fire this swipe item left method. And then another vue.js swipe event for a right swipe, which will fire this swipe item right method. So I'll jump down to these methods. So here is the swipe item left method. And this is first just going to check the distance that the user swiped by. So I'm checking if they swiped by more than 5 pixels. because I don't want this to be accidentally triggered if the user taps on this item. And then if it is more than 5 pixels, then we fire this move to offset min method, which is here. And this is basically just going to set the item offset value to our swipe offset min value. And the item offset is bound to the style property on the cue card. So I'm using transform translate X to move this card by whatever the value is in this item offset. Now this swipe offset min value, which determines the amount that we want to move this item by in order to reveal the items. I was previously declaring that variable right here and I was hard coding it. I think it was set to like -200 or something like that. But I'm now actually storing that value in my store, in my budget store. So I'll jump to store budgets. So I'm storing that value here now. And the reason I'm storing it here is because I realize that I need to make this value dynamic, because sometimes the width of all of these items which get displayed can change. So right now, if I inspect this budget item that's been swiped across, and the cue card is there. So right now this has been offset by -205 pixels, which reveals all of our items nicely. But if I jump to the settings page and change the text size to extra large, jump back to the budgets page and swipe left, you can see these items here are now much bigger. And so the overall width of all of these options is wider, which means I now need to adjust this offset accordingly. So if I inspect this cue card now, it's now being offset by -240 pixels. So if this swipe offset min value was hard coded as 205, then we would find that we wouldn't be able to see our items underneath here. So I'll just explain how I'm making this value dynamic. So I'm going to jump to the budgets list component, which is the parent component of these budget list item components. So I have a ref on this div, which is the parent element of this budgets list. And if we jump down to the setup method, I have a section of code here for figuring out the swipe offset width based on the width of the button icon list. And the button icon list is this list of button icons here. So I have an onActivated hook here, which will be fired every time this list is activated. So every time we navigate away and come back, this hook will be activated. And that's going to fire this calculate swipe offset min method here. And then I'm basically just grabbing the first button icon list element, so the first one of these, by using that budgets list container ref, and then using the query selector to grab the first button icon list. And then I'm just grabbing the width of that button icon list. And then I'm setting this swipe offset min value that's in the store to the width of this button icon list -5, which means that this offset will always be set to the exact width of this button icon list -5 pixels to give it a little bit of extra space. So whenever the width of these items changes, whether that's from changing the text size or changing the language, because different languages might have longer words underneath these icons, then this offset width will always update dynamically. So this item will always swipe across enough to reveal all of our options. Okay, so now I'll just show you the markup that I'm using for these button icons that you see here. So I'll jump back to budgets list item.vue and up to the template. So here's our cue card here, which we're able to swipe across. And this is contained within this div, which has a relative position. And then directly after the cue card, I have a div with a class of absolute to position it absolutely. And within that, we have our button icon list. And this button icon list component, if we open that up in buttons, button icon list, you can see this is just a cue tabs component, because I'm actually using Quasar's cue tabs component to display these. And I know this isn't a typical way that you would use cue tabs. You would normally use them in your footer, like I have down here. However, the style of cue tabs with the icon and the text underneath was exactly what I needed. And it already has all of the click animations and stuff like that built in. So I figured I might as well use it. And so if we jump to this button icon component, this is just a cue tab component. And I'm also using the same button icon list component button icon component, which are in turn using QTabs and QTab components in this edit budget dialog that you see down here as well. Let's take a look at this drag to reorder functionality. And I don't think there's any way to do this that's built into Quasar, so I'm using a package called Vue Draggable to do this. And if your project is a Vue 3 project, then you need to use the next version of Vue Draggable. So if you just Google Vue Draggable next and jump to this first link. So this is the package I'm using. And the way I got this up and running was I jumped to this live demos link. And then I jumped to this transitions example because this has this nice little animation that you can see as we drag our items. So then I just jumped to view code and basically just copied all of the code from this example and just added it to my budgets list component and basically just repurposed it around my budgets list items. But I haven't really done much differently here. The only things I've done differently is I've used some CSS to hide this ghost item that you can see underneath the item that we're dragging. See that little grayed out ghost item? So I'm just using some CSS to hide that completely so we don't see those ghosts. And I'm also using a little bit of CSS to add this yellow background to the item that we're dragging. And I've also changed some of the default options. So I'll just scroll down here. So I've changed these options a little bit and I'm also storing these options in my store. But that's really all I've done differently from this example. So I'm going to jump to my store file, store budgets, and just show you these options. So this animation option is just specifying the duration of the animation when we see the items jumping up and down in milliseconds. This group option is basically just an ID to identify this particular list. And this disabled option is quite important because this option allows us to enable and disable this view draggable functionality. And I'm actually doing that when I swipe left on an item to reveal options. So at this point, view draggable is actually disabled and I can't drag to reorder. So if I just jump to budgets list item.view and scroll down to this move to offset min method. So you can see I'm actually triggering an action in my budget store here to disable draggable. And that's here. And I'm just simply setting this disabled option to false. And then when we swipe this item back over to the right and this move to offset max method is fired, I'm again firing the enable draggable action in my store to re-enable draggable so that we can start dragging our items again. And this ghost class just adds a class to the ghost item that I mentioned before. So that's the class that I'm using to actually hide that ghost item. So if I just go to draggable.scss, I'm just setting that ghost to opacity 0 so that we can't see it. And this direction option means that we only want to drag items vertically and not horizontally. And this delay option specifies a delay so that after you tap on an item and hold, it will wait this long before the view draggable kicks in. So on mobile, we do have to tap and hold for a tiny little bit before we can actually drag and reorder our items. But then this delay on touch only option, which is set to true, means that this delay will only happen on mobile devices, but not on desktop. So if I just switch to desktop view, let's drag this over a bit, reload. On desktop, there is no delay. We can just click and drag these items straight away, which I think is a bit more intuitive on desktop, because on desktop apps, you do generally expect to be able to drag things straight away. And I did have some complaints about the original Fudget app on desktop, because on Fudget 1, we still have that delay on desktop for dragging and reordering items. And I still get quite a few people emailing me saying that they can't reorder items. And that's because they don't expect to have to tap and hold before they drag and reorder things. Let's see what's going on with this swipe to go back functionality. So basically any pane where we have a back button, such as this budgets button here, as well as clicking on that button to go back, we can also swipe the pane right to go back as well. And so we can also see this working in our settings section. If I go to the deepest point of the app, which is this answer page, we can swipe to go all the way back. And this is kind of an expected user interface pattern on mobile these days, especially on iOS. So I definitely wanted to get this working in this app. So this is actually really simple. I'm just going to jump to my Pane component in source, global, Pane and Pane.view. So again, I'm using one of Quasar's vTouch swipe events, and I'm only listening for a right swipe. And so whenever the user swipes right on one of these panes, it's going to fire this swipe pane right method. So I'll jump down to that, and that's here. And so before this method, I'm just seeing if this current pane has a back button in its pane header. So if I jump back up to the top, I have a ref on this pane called pane ref, and I have an unmounted hook here, which will be fired every time a pane is loaded for the first time. And I'm just using that ref that's on the parent component of the pane and using the query selector method to see if there's a button with this class pane header button back, which all of these back buttons have that class. So then when the user swipes right on a pane, this method is fired. And if there's a back button on this particular pane, and if that swipe was a touch event and not a mouse event, because we don't really need this functionality on desktop. And this bit here is just checking to see if the right swipe occurred in the first 50 pixels of the pane, the first 50 horizontal pixels. And if all of these things are true, then we just simply trigger a click on the back button that's in the header. And since these back buttons are already hooked up to change all of the state properties we need to slide a pane out of view, then we don't need to do anything else. We just need to trigger that click on this back button. So if I swipe right on this pane here now, all it's going to do is trigger a click on this settings button, thus taking us back to the settings page. And the reason I'm checking if the swipe is in the first 50 horizontal pixels of the pane is because it doesn't really make sense for a swipe over on the right here to trigger this back functionality. It only makes sense if the user swipes over here. And so if I add any more panes in future, which are kind of child panes, then I don't need to do anything fancy to get this swipe to go back functionality to work. All I need to do is make sure there's a back button in the header with this class, and I'm good to go. Let's look at this parallax effect that you can see when we navigate to child pages or when we go back again. So if you just keep an eye on this settings pane, while I tap on one of these options, you'll see this settings pane slide slightly to the left. And when we go back, we can see that settings pane slide back to the right, which gives this nice little iOS style parallax effect. And this is actually quite simple. I'm just going to jump to my pane component. In components, global, pane, pane.view. So I have a new prop called nudge left, which I've added here. And I'm binding to the class attribute on the root component of this pane. And I'm adding this nudge left class, which is a computed property. So I'll jump down to that, which is here. And first, I'm just making sure the value of that nudge left prop is not undefined. And if the value of that nudge left prop is true, then we just add this pane nudge left class to the root element of this pane component. So I'll just jump to the inspector. And if I just find this div, the root div of this pane, which is here, and if I add a class of pane-nudge-left, you can see all this class is doing is using transform and translate x to nudge the pane 90 pixels to the left. So then when we remove that class, we see it nudge back to the right again. So if I jump to a component which is using this nudge left prop, such as this settings component, so I'll jump to components, settings, and settings.view. So we can see I'm using this nudge left prop, and the value I'm passing in is store.settings.state.section active. And if I jump to my settings store and scroll down, That's this property here in my state. And so this is set to null by default, but when we tap on settings option, then this will be set to something like account or appearance or dates. And we're then sliding that settings section into view. So once this property section active is set to a value, it will then be truthy, which means this pane nudge left class will be added to the pane, thus pushing it to the left. So now all I need to do to achieve this nudge left effect is just add this nudge left prop to a pane and assign this to a truthy value. So back in video 3, I went into detail about these pane components, and I explained that they're made up of a pane header component, a pane footer component, and a pane body component, which is this scrollable area. And I have the pane body component open here. And I explained that I have these two spacer divs, one called pane header spacer, which was set to the height of the actual header, and one called pane footer spacer, which was set to the height of the pane footer. And I mentioned that at some point I would need to make the height of these spacers dynamic, so that if the height of the pane header or the pane footer changes, then the height of the relevant spacer would also change. And I've now managed to make the height of these spacers change dynamically according to the underlying height of the header and footer. But before I explain how I've done that, I'll just demonstrate what these spacers are doing and why I need them. So I'm just going to change my layout to iPhone 5 here, just so that the content of this page is actually longer than the height of the pane body, so that we need to scroll. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. So you can see right now we can scroll all the way down to the bottom of the content in this pane, and nothing is being obscured by the pane header or the pane footer. But if I just jump to the inspector and I jump to this Q scroll area, which is the pane body, and look for these spacers. So we can see them here. We have the pane header spacer and the pane footer spacer. Just drag this over a little bit. And so if I delete the pane footer spacer and we scroll down, we can no longer see all of the content of this pane because it's being obscured by this pane footer. And likewise, if I delete the pane header spacer, then we see the content of our pane go up behind the header. So that's why we need these spacers. So I'll just undo those deletions. But why do I need the height of these spacers to be dynamic? Well, I'm just going to switch back to iPhone 6, 7, 8 layout and increase the zoom to 125%. And I'm going to jump to the budgets page. And I'm actually just going to add a load of budgets here so that we have a scrollable pane. So I'm going to jump to store budgets. And I'm just going to duplicate these two budget items a bunch of times and save that. And these now go right off the page, so we have to scroll down to see them all. So right now we can see everything on the page, no problem. And if I inspect this pane footer here, it's currently 62 pixels tall. And if I find the pane footer spacer, which is here, that's also 62 pixels tall. However, if I jump to the settings page and appearance, and I change the text size to extra large and jump back to the budgets page and inspect the footer again, the pane footer, this is now 73 pixels tall because we increased the text size of this button, which increased the height of the button, which also increased the height of the pane footer. So in order for us to still be able to see all of our content at the bottom of the pane, then we also need to set the footer spacer to the same height, 73 pixels, which if we just look for that spacer, we can see it is 73 pixels tall. And there are other things besides changing the text size, which could change the height of the pane footers and headers. So if I just jump to my design, I have this all budgets balance widget, and this is actually toggleable by the user. So the user can hide this or show this at any time. So that's just another thing which would change the height of the pane footer. So I needed to listen out for any change in the height to the pane header or the pane footer, regardless of what caused it, to also trigger a change in height to the spacers as well. So I'll try and explain how this is working. So I'm going to jump to pane.vue, which is the main pane component. and I'll scroll down a bit. So I'm handling all of this stuff here. So I have an on-mounted hook, which will be fired when any pane is first mounted. Then I'm just getting a reference to the pane header spacer, the pane footer, and the pane footer spacer. And then I'm using the resize observer to watch the pane header and the pane footer for changes in height. So if I just Google resize observer, then you can learn more about this on the Mozilla page. And it says here, the resize observer interface reports changes to the dimensions of an element's content or border box. So I'm just using this to set up two resize observers, one for the pane header and one for the pane footer. And to initialize these, I'm just checking if there is a pane header on the current pane. And if so, I'm firing the observe method on either the pane header or the pane footer. So that means that the code inside these resize observers will be fired every time the dimensions of the pane header or the pane footer change. So let's say the user changes the text size and that increases the height of the header, then this hook will be fired, and all we're doing is grabbing the pane header spacer and setting the height to the new height of the pane header. And the same is all true for the pane footer. So now if anything whatsoever changes the height of the pane header or pane footer, regardless of what caused it, then the height of the relevant spacer will also be instantly changed. So even if we manually change the height of the header in the inspector, then this will still work. So right now the pane header is 51 pixels tall, and if we look for the pane header spacer, that's also 51 pixels tall. So if I just jump back to the pane header and manually set the height to, let's say, 100 pixels, and we look at the pane header spacer, we can see that instantly the pane header spacer has also been changed to a height of 100 pixels. So I was highly skeptical about the composition API at first, and I didn't really like it. The options API always made sense to me, and it was the simplicity of the options API which drew me towards Vue in the first place, more so than the other big frameworks. But as you can probably tell by now, I've decided to use the composition API throughout the app, and there are two main reasons for this. Number one is that I'm already using the composition API for my state management, and number two is that I've seen evidence in the Vue 3 source code, which suggests to me that Vue 3 might be more optimized for the composition API than the options API, and also that the Vue developers might consider the options API as legacy now. So this is from the Vue 3 source code, and we see this test here, which refers to the options API as legacy options. And in this other bit of code, we also see an interface called legacy options. And in this bit of code here, we can see that if we use options API hooks, they're converted into composition API hooks under the hood. So it looks to me like extra code is being fired under the hood when we use the options API in a Vue 3 project. And now I don't know this for certain, and I'm not stating this as a fact, but this implies to me that there could possibly be a performance hit when using the options API in a Vue 3 project. And again, I don't know this for sure. It could be that there's no performance difference whatsoever if we use the options API, but performance is so critical to me for this app that any small bit of doubt makes me want to use the composition API. But what do I think about the composition API now, having used it for several weeks on a real world project? Well, after a shaky start, I've got to say that I'm actually starting to quite like it now. And I can explain why by looking at my Pane component, which is one of my more complex components so far. So I'll jump to source components, global, Pane, and pane.vue. So in this component, in my setup function, I have 4 different sets of functionality. So I have some code here which manages the Pane position classes for the desktop version. I have some code here for managing the nudge left class, which creates the parallax effect. Then I have some code here for handling the swipe left to go back. And then I have some code for watching changes to the height of the pane header or pane footer and setting the spacers to the same height. Now, using the composition API, I've been able to keep all of these separate functionalities together. in standalone blocks of code without anything being scattered all over the place. Whereas if I'd used the options API for this component, then I wouldn't have been able to do that. Because, for example, I have a computed property here and a computed property here. And these computed properties are completely unrelated. But if I'd used the options API, then I would have had to bundle these computed properties together in the computed option. And if I scroll down a bit, this bit which handles the swipe to go back, and this bit which watches for changes to the Pane header and footer, these are both using unmounted hooks. But using the composition API, I've been able to keep this functionality where it belongs in the appropriate block of code. Whereas if I'd used the options API, then this code here and all of this code here would have been bundled together in a single mounted hook. And also if I'd used the options API and we look at this swipe right to go back code, then this variable, this code in the unmounted hook and this swipe pane right method would all have been separated because the variable would have been in the data method and this bit would have been in the mounted hook and this method would have been in the methods option. So even though there are still some things I don't like about the composition API, like having to import things from Vue all the time and having to return everything at the bottom of the setup method, I think the fact that I can keep all of my relevant functionality together like this in organized blocks more than makes up for those little annoyances. And I think the value of being able to do this will become more apparent as the app gets more complicated and as I start adding data to the app and more complicated logic, etc. And by the way, let me know in the comments what you think of the composition API so far. Let us know what your experience has been like. So finally, I just want to show you the performance of Fudget 2 so far on a real device. So what you can see on the screen here is my iPhone XS. And when I ran the app on a real device in development mode, it was a little bit slow, which got me a little bit nervous. But then I built the app for production and launched that app on the real device, and the performance has absolutely blown me away. So right now I don't have any apps running on the phone. So I'm going to start this from a cold boot. So I'm going to tap on the icon. And you can see the app loads instantly. There's no lag or delay in loading the app. And if we navigate through all of the pages all load instantly. And again, there's no delay or lag or anything. And when we navigate through nested pages, so if I go to the settings section and then down through the help section, all the animations are super smooth and the parallax effect is super smooth. And when we swipe to go back, it's again all super smooth. And if we go to a really long page, then scrolling down, all of the content is again super smooth. We get the nice little bounce at the top and bottom, and all the button animations and stuff like that are super smooth. And if I jump back to the settings page and appearance, if we change the language, it changes instantly. There's no flicker or delay or anything, just instantly changes. And the same for the theme as well. If we change that, just changes instantly. And the same for text size as well. That just instantly changes all of the text size in the app. And I'll just set the text size back and jump to the budgets page. So the swipe to reveal options, again, is super smooth and silky. And the animations on the buttons are really nice as well. And the drag to reorder, again, the animation on that is just super smooth. And also all of the dialogues, they appear super smoothly and disappear really smoothly as well. So everything is just super fast and snappy. And this isn't a brand new device, it's an iPhone XS from 2018, over 2.5 years old. And even on this, the app just feels completely native to me. And I just hope that this performance continues when I start adding data to the app and start adding all of the real guts of the app. But for now, I'm super happy with this performance. So I'm going to carry on working on this budget section. I still have quite a lot to do here, such as adding this all budgets balance widget, adding these tooltips, and adding a folder item like this, and adding these drawers, and adding this multiple selection thing as well. Let me know in the comments if you would do any of this stuff differently, or if you have any questions, and check out the link to the full playlist in the description. Please hover over my face and click subscribe if you don't want to miss any of the videos in this series. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.